We have heard here recently suggested that the best method of meeting communism is not necessarily by force, that there is something else also which is required, that we have got to show the people who are going to resist communism that there is a way of life, that there is a way of life which is worth defending. We believe that that is true, and we want to be in Ireland to be in a position in which we will feel that we are defending all the things that are worth defending, that we are defending the sacred liberties of our people. And as long as a powerful nation which is near us, by horse force, divides that ancient nation and subjects a large portion of the people that are cut off to a foreign rule against their will, then as long as that exists, so long will Irishmen feel that if there is to be liberty defended, it has first to be defended on Irish shores. I am, on that account, not going to vote for that motion.
The ideal Ireland that we would have, the Ireland that we dreamed of, would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living, of a people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit, a land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forms for the wisdom of serene old age, the home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. With the tidings that make such an Ireland possible, St. Patrick came to our ancestors 1,500 years ago, promising happiness here no less than happiness hereafter. It was the pursuit of such an Ireland that later made our country worthy to be called the island of saints and scholars. It was the idea of such an Ireland, happy, vigorous, spiritual, that fired the imagination of our poets, that made successive generations of patriotic men give their lives to win religious and political liberty, and that will urge men in our own and future generations to die, if need be, so that these liberties may be preserved. 100 years ago, the young Irelanders, by holding up the vision of such an Ireland before the people, inspired them and moved them spiritually as our people had hardly been moved since the golden age of Irish civilization. 50 years later, the founders of the Gaelic League similarly inspired and moved the people of their day. So later did the leaders of the Irish Volunteers. We of this time, if we have the will and the active enthusiasm, have the opportunity to inspire and move our generation in like manner. We can do so by keeping this thought of a noble future for our country constantly before our minds, ever seeking in action to bring that future into being, and ever remembering that it is for our nation as a whole that future must be sought. Certain newspapers have been very persistent in looking for my answer to Mr. Churchill's recent broadcast. I know the kind of answer I am expected to make. I know the answer that first springs to the lips of every man of Irish blood who heard or read that speech, no matter in what circumstances or in what part of the world he found himself. I know the reply I would have given a quarter of a century ago. But I have deliberately decided that this is not the reply I shall make tonight. I shall strive not to be guilty of adding any fuel to the flames of hatred and passion, which, if continue to be fed, promise to burn up whatever is left by the war of decent human feeling in Europe. Allowances can be made for Mr. Churchill's statement, however unworthy, in the first flush of his victory. No such excuse can be found for me in this quiet atmosphere. There are, however, some things which it is my duty to say, some things which it is essential to say. I shall try to say them as dispassionately as I can. Mr. Churchill makes it clear that in certain circumstances he would have violated our neutrality and that he would justify his action by Britain's necessity. It seems strange to me that Mr. Churchill does not see that this, if accepted, would mean that Britain's necessity would become a moral code, and that when this necessity was sufficiently great, other people's rights were not to count. It is quite true that other great powers believe in this same code in their own regard and have behaved in accordance with it. That is precisely why we have the disastrous successions of wars. World War number 1, World War number 2, and shall it be World War number 3. Surely Mr. Churchill must see that if his contention be admitted in our regard, a like justification can be framed for similar acts of aggression elsewhere, and no small nation adjoining a great power could ever hope to be permitted to go its own way in peace. It is indeed fortunate that Britain's necessity did not reach the point when Mr. Churchill would have acted. All credit to him that he successfully resisted the temptation, which I have no doubt many times assailed him in his difficulties, and to which I freely admit many leaders might have easily succumbed. It is indeed hard for the strong to be just to the weak, but acting justly always has its rewards. By resisting his temptation in this instance, Mr. Churchill, instead of adding another horrid chapter to the already blood-stained record of the relations between England and this country, has advanced the cause of international morality, an important step, one of the most important indeed that can be taken on the road to the establishment of any sure basis for peace. As far as the peoples of these two islands are concerned, it may perhaps mark a fresh beginning towards the realization of that mutual comprehension to which Mr. Churchill has referred, and for which he has prayed, and for which I hope he will not merely pray but work also, as did his predecessor, who will yet, I believe, find the honored place in British history which is due to him, as certainly he will find it in any fair record of the relations between Britain and our sailors. That Mr. Churchill should be irritated when our neutrality stood in the way of what he thought he vitally needed, I understand. But that he or any thinking person in Britain or elsewhere should fail to see the reason for our neutrality, I find it hard to conceive. I would like to put a hypothetical question. It is a question I have put to many Englishmen since the last war. Suppose Germany had won the war, had invaded and occupied England, and that after a long lapse of time and many bitter struggles, she was finally brought to acquiesce in admitting England's right to freedom and let England go, but not the whole of England. All but, let us say, the 6 southern counties. These 6 southern counties, those commanding the entrance to the narrow seas, Germany, let us suppose, had singled out and insisted on holding herself with a view to weakening England as a whole and maintain the security of our communications to the Straits of Dover. Let us suppose Germany was engaged in a great war in which she could show that she was on the side of the freedom of a number of small nations. Would Mr. Churchill, as an Englishman, who believed that his own nation had as good a right to freedom as any other, not freedom for a part merely, but freedom for the whole, would he, whilst Germany still maintained the partition of his country and occupied 6 counties of it, would he lead this partitioned England to join with Germany in a crusade? I do not think Mr. Churchill would. Would he think the people of partitioned England an object of shame if they stood neutral in such circumstances? I do not think Mr. Churchill would. Mr. Churchill is proud of Britain's stand alone after France had fallen and before America entered the war. Could he not find it in his heart the generosity to acknowledge that there is a small nation that stood alone, not for 1 year or two, but for several hundred years against aggression, that endured spoliations, famines, massacres in endless succession, that was clubbed many times into insensibility, but at each time on returning consciousness took up the fight anew, a small nation that could never be got to accept defeat and has never surrendered her soul. Mr. Churchill is justly proud of his nation's perseverance against heavy odds. But we in this island are still prouder of our people's perseverance for freedom through all the centuries. We of our time have played our part in that perseverance, and we have pledged ourselves to the dead generations who have preserved intact for us this glorious heritage, that we too will strive to be faithful to the end and pass on this tradition unblemished. Many a time in the past there appeared little hope, except that hope to which Mr. Churchill referred, that by standing fast for a time, his own word, the tyrant would make some ghastly mistake which would alter the whole balance of the struggle. I sincerely trust, however, that it is not thus our ultimate unity and freedom will be achieved. Though as a younger man, I confess I prayed even for that, and at times indeed saw no other. In later years, I have had a vision of a much nobler and better ending, better for both our peoples and for the future of mankind. For that, I have now been long working. I regret that it is not to this nobler purpose that Mr. Churchill is lending his hand, rather than by the abuse of a people who have done him no wrong, trying to find an excuse in a crisis like the present for continuing the injustice of the mutilation of our country. I sincerely hope that Mr. Churchill has not deliberately chosen the latter course, but if he has, however regretfully we may say it, we can only say, be it so. Even as a partitioned small nation, we shall go on and strive to play our part in the world, continuing unswervingly to work for the cause of true freedom and for peace and understanding between all nations. As a community which has been mercifully spared from all major sufferings, as well as from the blinding hates and rancors engendered by the present war, we shall endeavor to render thanks to God by playing a Christian part in helping, so far as a small nation can, to bind up some of the gaping wounds of suffering humanity.
Welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany began the invasion of Poland. Months of diplomacy had failed, and for the second time in just over 20 years, Europe was at war. The following day, the 2nd of September, Dáil Éireann convened to rush through a constitutional amendment which would allow for the declaration of a state of emergency. War had seemed inevitable since Adolf Hitler withdrew from the German-Polish non-aggression pact in April, and Dáil Éireann was committed to Ireland remaining neutral in the coming conflict. Declaring a state of emergency would allow for the Fianna Fáil government to introduce legislation which would usually contravene the constitution. On the one hand, such legislation was essential for securing and maintaining Irish neutrality. On the other hand, however, it would bestow near dictatorial power on the government. The main opposition party, Fine Gael, backed Irish neutrality in the face of their identification with the Commonwealth. The successors of Cumann Gael and those who had supported the Anglo-Irish Treaty during the Civil War, they favoured continued Commonwealth membership, while Fianna Fáil, made up of many of those who had opposed the treaty, had stopped attending meetings since 1932. There was considerable anti-British sentiment on the ground in Ireland at the time, and Fine Gael's support for neutrality prevented the country splitting into pro-German and pro-British camps. The amendment was debated only briefly before being passed in both houses of the Oireachtas and sent to the President for his signature. Immediately afterwards, Eamon Devalera rose and put forward the following motion: that Dáil Éireann hereby resolves that arising out of the armed conflict now taking place in Europe, a national emergency exists affecting the vital interests of the state. Following this motion, the Emergency Powers Bill was introduced, a far-reaching piece of legislation which gave considerable authority to the government. It allowed ministers to make emergency orders to regulate and control any supplies or services which were deemed essential to the state, to take possession of or use any land or property whatsoever, and to censor newspapers, radio broadcasts and communication by post or telegraph. It also allowed for the arrest without warrant of any non-national or any person suspected of being about to commit a crime. A future amendment would allow the government to arrest Irish citizens, which would be used to intern up to 2,000 members of the Irish Republican Army. There was considerable apprehension amongst the opposition regarding the powers that De Valera was asking for, especially those that allowed ministers to order an arrest. Men now sat in government who once sat in prison cells under the watch of those on the opposition benches. Born of a war of independence and a brutal civil war, Irish democracy was still young. In 1932, when Fianna Fáil came to power for the first time, TDs carried revolvers under their coats, fearing that the outgoing Cumann Gael party would try to stage a military coup. Leaving office peacefully, they later merged with the Blue Shirts, mostly former National Army soldiers, to form Fine Gael. There was still considerable distrust between these two parties, but also an understanding that these powers would be needed to preserve Irish neutrality. After a mammoth 14-hour session, the Emergency Powers Act was signed into law at 10 minutes to 5 on the morning of the 3rd of September. A few hours later, Britain and France formally declared war on Germany. Over the next 6 years, Ireland would face numerous challenges to its stability and to its neutrality. Germany drafted plans for the invasion of Ireland, while in the early years, Britain considered seizing a number of Irish ports and possibly overthrowing the government. The entry of the United States into the war brought further pressure on Irish neutrality, and US Ambassador to Ireland, David Gray, held séances with dead British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, who told him that Ireland was assisting Nazi Germany. Internal threats to the state were just as stark. In January of 1939, the Irish Republican Army, proclaiming themselves to be the legitimate government of Ireland, had declared war on Britain and began a bombing campaign which they would later coordinate with Nazi intelligence. Several members of An Garda Síochána would be killed in clashes with the IRA, while the full might of the Emergency Powers Act would be used against them, resulting in mass-scale internment and 6 volunteers booted by the state. For most Irish people, the emergency meant hardship and deprivation. Rationing was introduced as supplies became scarce, and censorship was used not only to guard Irish neutrality, but also to suppress publications which went against the staunch Catholic views of the government. Tens of thousands of Irishmen would serve in the defence forces, prepared to repel any invasion, though some would desert to join the thousands of Irish serving in the Allied armies and fight in the major engagements of the Second World War. They would suffer discrimination on their return home and in many cases would never again speak of their experiences. The emergency was a major test of Irish democracy and a severe strain on the nation following the economic war of the mid-30s. Neutrality was an affirmation of Irish sovereignty, but it would also see Ireland isolated in the post-war years, having not shouldered the same burden as the founding members of the United Nations. Even though Ireland rendered invaluable service to the Allied cause throughout the war, it remained stubbornly committed to neutrality, De Valera even going so far as to visit the German ambassador in Dublin on the 2nd of May 1945 to offer his condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. Today, modern Ireland continues to be shaped by the events of the emergency. It cemented Ireland's commitment to neutrality and would govern how we were perceived by the world at large for decades to come. Along with regular episodes covering the events.
The flag of Éire flies over the Viceregal Lodge as Mr. De Valera receives his seal of office as Prime Minister, and congratulations on his appointment from the new President of Éire, Dr. High. The greatest day in the history of the Irish Free State, the celebration of another victory for Mr. De Valera. In the election, he has just won his first clear majority since he came into power 6 years ago, and today his nominee, Dr. Douglas High, is being installed as first president. Dr. Hyde has been accepted by all parties to be in every sense a representative of the nation. So a Protestant becomes the leader of a mainly Roman Catholic country.